Hi, this is Jonathan. This is part 3 of a series of videos that I'm doing about tones, so stick around. The effects that you buy, they help to kind of shape the sound that you want to represent, or rather the tone of your guitar. Ultimately, the tone will also depend on your guitar. The wood, the pickups, even your amps, what sort of amps you're using. Is it a tube amp, a transistor? This was all discussed in the previous video. Now, today I'm going to touch on the individual pedals that we use. As for me, as I stated many times, I'm using the Line 6 Helix, so all this is in one multi-effects pedal board. But I have started out with pedals, individual pedals. So for ease of explaining, I'm going to just basically use the Boss pedals as examples. I think they are pretty easy to learn, a bit of an idiot proof. It's really easy to use, and the parameters are not that complicated. So I've always kind of differentiate effects chain very differently. I would have the intrusive effects and the non-intrusive effects. The intrusive effects are like, for example, the compressors, the distortion, the overdrive, and the wah-wah, where it actually alters the tone of your guitar, right, when it goes to the amp. The non-intrusive ones are basically the time-based unit and, of course, the EQ. EQ units, I'll put it at the back because I can actually shape the sound after the fact, so these are non-intrusive. So I always separate these two effects as intrusive and non-intrusive. Now, the first intrusive effect I want to talk about a little bit is the compressor. Now, compressors are really useful. I use compressors all the time. In fact, I have the compressor on all the time. Well, basically for me, I would set the compressors to a kind of like 2.1 ratio with a little bit of a compression with normal attack and release, just to have it balance, all the strings and whatever I'm playing is all balanced before it goes to the amp, so that I could play really hard, and yet not blow out the amp. You know what I'm talking about? Like, you know, I don't have unwanted distortion going to the amp when I'm playing too loud. So the compressors help in maintaining a good healthy signal to the amp. So depending on your pickups, you know, especially the single coils non-active pickups, you would have discrepancy in volume levels among the pole pieces as well as among strings. So with the EMGs or with the active pickups, you have a little bit less of that. But of course, you know, you can always manipulate all this by lowering the pickups on the lower strings, you know, and you know, vice versa. You can kind of like shape your guitar, your pickups position on your guitar. But in general, you know, compressors are meant to control the overall output of your guitar into whatever you're going through. So I've always put my compressors as the first effect in the whole chain, unless my guitar is really noisy, in which case I have a noise gate. You know, so a noise gate would more or less eliminate any static, any 60 cycle hum. They try to before going to the compressors. You have to be very careful with noise gates, so play around with it. There's also a threshold and there's also a release, so play around with it and see which one is the best result. If your pickups are just too noisy, change the pickups. The next pedal I want to talk about is the distortion pedal. The distortion pedal and the next pedal after that, the OverDrive, we use it when we have an amp, or whether we are using an amp that is relatively clean. But if the amp has a good dirty channel and a good solo channel, I would not use these pedals at all, because I would use the distortion that is in the amp or the overdrive section in the amp, and then I will put the time or the non-intrusive effects in the effects loop of the amp. Now this is in a scenario where you are presented with an amp that doesn't have a good distortion or a good overdrive section. So say for example a JTC 120 or a twin reverb or something like that, a good clean amp. Now the distortion pedal, the basic distortion pedal, will only have 3 parameters: tone, drive, and volume. In some cases you have the gain or the drive, which is the same, and then the tone, and then the level. So basically the tone is for you to shape the sound. You know, if it's too muffled, you can kind of brighten it. The drive or the gain is where you adjust how much of a drive or gain that you are outputting from this unit. So basically I would use distortion as the sort of like for power chords, you know, and for little solo things that I don't want my solo to be overdriven, just a little bit of a distortion, so I probably use distortion pedal. I'll probably use a distortion pedal for that. So keep in mind, the distortion pedal is not an overdrive unit, right? Now the next pedal we're talking about is the overdrive unit, and this is where you overdrive. So in other words, it's where you overdrive the amp, and then you crank out a whole lot of distortion coming out. So again, in this case, if you are working with a amp that doesn't have all this built in, and you are dependent on the effects pedal, again it comes to the same thing. You know, you have the drive or gain, the tone, and the level. So the level knobs for all this, the overdrive and distortion, plays a part for you when you are playing live, because you can always have the distortion set in one level, you know, the volume level at just say for example 0.5, and then you only use the overdrive unit for solos, and of course you want the solo to be louder. You can set it at maybe 7, you know, the level of the overdrive unit to 7 or 8 depending. And again, if you want to have these both units on concurrently, then you have to adjust your overdrive unit gain in the proper level, because if it's too saturated, you're going to have fuzz city. The next pedal I want to talk about is the chorus pedal. It's very popular back in the 80s, 90s, you know, but as the years went by, I hear less and less of this effect. It's really great for chord works, you know, for chords. Sometimes you can get away with it on solos, you know. But as I said, you know, you hear it less and less. But if you were to utilize the chorus effect with the delay unit, you can get away with some nice pad sounds, you know, some really nice lush sounding pads. So the parameters for the chorus effect would be the depth, rate, EQ, and of course the mix, you know, how loud you want the chorus to be, how much chorus do you want in the sound. So play around with all this, be aware that if you put too much depth, then you're gonna have some weird effect, you know. And you have to balance two of these parameters, the rate and the depth, in such a way where you can have a nice chorusy sound. So play around with it, and of course if it's a bit too bright, you know, with the chorus and everything, you can always play around with your tone. And again, you can also adjust how much chorus effect you want in your sound. So depending on what sort of music you're playing, you know, for me, I will probably set it in a generic effect in such a way where I can use it for my pad work, you know, for the volume swell and delays, or I could just use it for, like, you know, nice arpeggios, nice chords, you know, with the delay unit. Of course, the next unit we're talking about is the delay unit, which is the most useful effect in my humble opinion. You know, it's the most useful effect. There are many variables. You can have short slapback, and you can have like a really short where you sound like you're doubling the guitars. Especially if you have a stereo delay unit, you can actually have, you know, this wide spectrum of effect, like, you know, like you're hearing like a stereo sounding guitars, you know, with these short delays. The parameters for the delay unit are essentially level, delay time, feedback, and sometimes you have this thing called rate, you know, RATE, where you can add a little bit of wobble towards the end of your delay repeats. Of course, the level will dictate how much delay you want to have in your overall sound. And then the delay time, you know, some of the units have tap delay, so you can actually tap according to a tempo. That's really useful. And of course, you have the feedback, how much feedback repeats, like bum, 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 bum. How much feedback do you want, you know, so you can always adjust it. And then of course the rate. Sometimes you have a different control where you can adjust different different values, different time values, you know, and you can get away with many cool results. Take a listen to Edge. You know, he's a master for all these parameters of the delay unit. All right. The next pedal we're talking about is the reverb unit. And of course, if you have a good reverb unit in your amp, you will probably use your amp reverb unit. But a good reverb unit can radically change your sound. You know, if you have a good reverb unit, a reverb unit which gives you the flexibility of using, like, you know, plate reverbs, spring, hall, chamber, you can actually play without delay, without the delay unit, because you can. Most of the reverb units will have these parameters, like, you know, level, time, pre-delay, and of course the other one would be shape. Sometimes you have that shape, you know, how you can always shape the sound of the reverb. The time, of course, how long you want the reverb to be, like a big cave to a small room. The pre-delays are really useful because you can have it. You can have the reverb sounding after a preset delay time, right? In a couple of milliseconds, and that's really useful. Sometimes I would use a plate reverb instead of a delay, because sometimes you just want a little bit of variation in the sound, so that when you're doing a solo, you're not stuck with the delay sound all the time. Last but not least is the EQ effects pedal, Equalizer effects pedal. Most of it comes with the graphic EQ style, and this is easy for us because we can just see how the curve is going to be. But again, less is more, so don't try to EQ too much. If the sound is about there, I'd rather you EQ through the amp, the preamp of the amp. But the EQ pedal is useful for situations like, you know, when you're going to different places to play, and every room and every hall sounds different. So I would use the EQ effects pedal as a sort of a compensation for the place that I'm playing. For example, if this place that I'm playing is kind of like a bit dark, you know, I would probably brighten up a bit. But if this hall is really bright, then I'll probably cut down, or you know, I'll do adjustment with my graphics EQ pedal. So all these pedals that I'm talking about are available in my Line 6 multi-effects board, and I use all this the same way as I would use individual effects. But as I mentioned in the last video, when I'm using the Line 6 stuff, it gets a bit complicated. For example, the Helix, where, or even as far back as the X3, because I have the luxury of doing double amps, meaning I could have 2 amps, which I did last time in when I'm playing live. I used to have 2 Marshall JCM 800s, and I would patch my effects. You know, I used to have a rack effect, so I would have the choruses, you know, they'll be in stereo, the delays will be in stereo, and it's like, you know, will come out with these 2 amps in the 2 cabinets, and that gives you the you know, the effect of a big wide stereo sound, you know. But with the Helix, it takes it a bit further, and that's the beautiful part of the Helix, because I can actually have 2 sets of effects if I want to. But in most cases, I will opt not. I would choose not to, because of the DSP power involved. So I would have these 2 amps with their separate cabinets, and I will adjust whatever EQ I have, because 2 different amps have 2 different characteristics. So in any case, they just sound different. Then I'll have it in such a way where my effects are after all these amps, like, you know, all these stereo effects. This stereo amp, they will go through the stereo input of all the effects, and then I have this big huge sound that you'll probably hear in some of my videos when I'm doing, like, you know, chorus effects or distortion, you know, or power chords. You'll hear that it's kind of big. It's not like in the center. So these are some of the things that you can get away with on a multi effects unit. It's really useful for me, whether in live situation or whether in recording. So I hope you like this video. For part 4, I will talk about how the way you play will dictate your tone, in conjunction with the effects units that you are using, as well as the way you play and the amps that you're using. This 3 element will help to shape your sound. And depending on your genre, depending on your skill level, depending on your guitar, your effects, you would have a wide array of choices as to what do I use for certain parts of the song or certain songs. There's always this school of thought where less is more. Sometimes you don't even use any effects. You know, I've known players, you know, who use the minimal effect. You know, just clean sound, probably a distortion pedal, or just the amp's distortion. In fact, they don't even have any pedal board. They'll just have the amp foot switch, and that's all they go by. I can do that if I have a good amp, like if the DeVille. You know, if I have a DeVille, I don't need all these things. Probably a delay pedal. Probably can't live without a delay pedal. But that's about it. You know, I could use the amp's distortion and the overdrive section. You know, I can get by with a gig. So it all depends. So stay tuned for the next part of the video, and if you like this video, give me a thumbs up, and feel free to subscribe to this channel, and press that bell so you'll be notified of videos that comes out in the future. So in the meantime, you guys take care. Ciao.